In general, any fabric that you can sew on your standard home sewing machine can be sewn with an overlock machine. From fine silks and heirloom quality batiste to ultra suede and real leather. Your choices of needle, thread, and tension adjustments will determine your level of success, just as with any sewing project. Your instruction manual and CD give you important information about setting up your Brother overlock machine, choosing the correct needles and threads, and much more. They're the most important resources for helping you to successfully use your machine and learning the basics of serging. Let's review some of those basics before we start stitching. Your Brother overlock machine uses standard household sewing machine needles. Be sure to use the size needles recommended for your machine and for the fabric you're sewing. A needle smaller than size 9 may not be able to stand up to the pressure of a serger's speed. A needle that is too large can damage your serger. Inspect your needles and change them often. Needles that are dull, bent, or have burrs can result in poor stitch quality and damage to your machine. Specialty needles that you use in your standard sewing machine can be used in your Brother overlock machine as well. When serging knits, try ballpoint or stretch needles rather than universal needles. Microtex or sharp needles are ideal for sewing microfibers. Embroidery, metallic, and top stitching needles have larger eyes and deeper scarves to help prevent thread fraying and breakage when sewing or serging with decorative threads. You can use regular sewing thread, serger thread, and decorative thread in your overlock machine. Be sure to use good quality thread. Bargain thread can break easily during an overlock machine's high-speed stitching. You should also make sure that your thread is new. Throw out thread that you've had around for years. It will only cause you grief when you try to use it in your serger or your standard sewing machine. Keep your thread out of sunlight and keep it dust-free. When serging seams and edge finishes that will be unseen in your finished project, use regular sewing thread or serger thread. When selecting 3 or 4 spools or cones of thread for these seams, it's not necessary that all the threads match each other or your fabric. Match the thread in the needle that sews the seam line to the fabric, and use blending colors like cream, gray, or rose in the loopers and in the second needle if one is inserted. One of the many wonderful things about an overlock machine is the ability it gives you to construct a project and add embellishment at the same time. There are so many beautiful decorative threads available for use in your serger that you may have a difficult time deciding which to use for any given project. Many of these threads, including buttonhole twist, woolly nylon, rayon, polyester and cotton embroidery threads, and fine metallics can be used in both the needles and loopers. Heavier threads like pearl cotton, heavy metallics, yarns, pearl crown rayon, braids, crochet thread, ribbon, and ribbon floss should either be used only in the loopers or stitched over with your serger. Now, let's get ready to stitch. When you sew, it's usually best to baste your fabric first. Basting is especially important to ensure proper fit when constructing garments with an overlock machine. After all, once your seam is stitched and trimmed, there's no seam allowance left to be let out if the garment is too tight. Avoid pins for basting if you can. Use glue stick, basting glue, or basting tape whenever possible. When it's necessary to use pins, place them parallel rather than perpendicular to the seam line. If you must put them perpendicular for better hold, use as few pins as possible. Stitch slowly and remove the pins well before they reach the knives. One of the biggest keys to using an overlock machine is understanding the tension dials. These dials control whether the stitch you use is a balanced stitch or an unbalanced one, or whether it's the stitch you need for the application at hand. Getting comfortable with the tension dials is a giant step in learning to sew with an overlock machine. You might want to use the sample stitches you learn as we go along to start a reference notebook. Write down the tension and other settings, fabric and threads that you use for a given stitch, and add to your book as you try different fabrics, threads, and techniques. In a balanced stitch, the upper and lower threads meet or knit at the edge of the fabric. Balanced stitches are generally used for basic construction applications such as sewing seams and overcasting the edges of seams and hems. You can sew a seam with either the 3 or 4 thread balanced stitch of your brother serger. If you're sewing a seam in woven fabric that won't be top stitched, it's often best to use a 4 thread stitch. The 4 thread balanced stitch produces a durable yet flexible seam. It uses both needles and both loopers. The 4 thread stitch is appropriate for sewing seams in both woven and knit fabrics. Let's sew a conventional seam that will be on the inside of our project. Thread both needles and loopers with sewing or serger thread. For medium weight fabric, set all 4 tension dials to 4. If the stitch is unbalanced, adjust the tension in one needle, then the other if needed. Then stitch. When sewing seams with an overlock machine, always let the knives trim some of the fabric. That way, you'll have neater edges and even stitches. You can stitch your seams in the conventional manner with right sides together, or place wrong sides together to create exposed seams. Use standard thread or decorative thread for exposed seams. Top stitch the seams to one side if you want them to lay flat. Use the balanced 4 thread stitch to stitch ribbing to your projects. Increase your stitch length and stitch with the ribbing on top. This allows the feed dogs to help ease the base fabric to the ribbing. Edge stitching or overcasting with your serger is the perfect way to prevent raveling of woven fabrics. Sew seams in heavy fabrics such as denim, corduroy, or velveteen with a standard sewing machine. Then, use a 4 thread stitch for a sturdy, secure seam finish. On medium weight fabric, seamed with a standard sewing machine, you can also serge seam allowances together, then press to one side. Create mock flat fill seams in medium to heavyweight fabric by straight stitching the seams, then serging the seam allowances together. Press them to one side. For extra security, thread the lower looper with fusible thread and fuse the seam allowances. Turn the fabric to the right side. Thread your sewing machine with heavy thread like buttonhole twist and top stitch through the seam allowances right next to the seam. Top stitch again about 1/4 of an inch away. Make sure you stitch through all layers. Shoulder and pocket seams will sometimes sag or stretch if not reinforced or stabilized. This is especially true when sewing knits. To prevent stretching, add twill tape to reinforce seams while stitching them. Thread your brother serger with sewing or serger thread. Choose normal tension settings. Place the twill tape on the seam line before stitching. You can use a dab of glue stick to keep it in place. Be sure that the strip is caught in the seam as you serge. For a less visible reinforcement, use sheer stay tape, narrow washable satin ribbon in a color that matches the fabric, or, for woven fabrics, cut a strip from the selvage and use it for stabilizing the seam. For a stabilized seam with a slight bit of stretch, use tricot bias binding. You can easily create soft gathers in lightweight fabric with the 4-thread stitch and the all-purpose foot. Finish one side of the fabric you're planning to gather with a narrow hem sewn on your sewing machine or a rolled hem created on your overlock machine. Increase the tension in both needles and turn your differential feed setting to 2.0. Set the stitch length to 4.0 and the width to 5.0. Serge the unfinished edge of the fabric, creating the ruffle. Then, add it to your project. Making pouches to fill with cosmetics, crayons, toys, paintbrushes, or anything you know the recipient will love creates a gift to be cherished. Personalizing the bag before stitching will give it that really special touch. Use a balanced 4-thread stitch to insert the zipper. Place the zipper on the fabric right sides together. Stitch through the zipper and the fabric, being careful of the zipper teeth. Stitch the seams with a conventional sewing machine and serge the seam edges. A balanced 3-thread seam has more stretch than a 4-thread seam, making it ideal for knits. Use the left needle for a wider stitch and the right needle for a narrow stitch. The weight of the fabric and the thread you're using in the loopers will dictate which to use. Set all tension dials to 4 and adjust the differential feed to between 0 and 2. Stitch length should be between 3 and 4, and the knife width should be between 4 and 5. For areas of your project that may receive extra stress, straight stitch along the needle line of the 3-thread stitch for a more secure seam. 3-thread stitches sewn with decorative thread are perfect for stitching exposed seams in sewing projects. Exposed seams become a part of your project's design, so tension and stitches should be perfect. Remember that decorative threads are often heavier and require tension adjustments. Heavier threads also need a longer stitch length. Always do test stitching with the project fabric, needles, and thread to perfect your tension settings before sewing the project. Securing seam ends is especially important when seams are exposed. Even when a seam is crossed by another seam, you may want to straight stitch along the stitching lines for a few inches with a standard sewing machine. If a seam will not be crossed by another seam, liquid seam sealant such as Fray Check or No Fray is the most aesthetically pleasing choice for securing the exposed seam. A balanced 3-thread stitch with a medium length is a perfect choice for sewing lingerie. By removing the stitch finger, you can achieve a very narrow seam. Remove the left needle and the removable stitch finger. Tension settings should start at 4, and differential feed settings should be in the normal range. Experiment with the upper and lower looper tensions to get just the right seams. The narrow 3-thread stitch is also a good choice for joining lace or adding lace to your projects. Stitch length should be between 2.5 and 3.5. Start with the tension settings at 4. With the left needle and the stitch finger removed, do a test stitch and adjust the tensions and differential feed if necessary. Soon you'll be easily adding lace to handkerchiefs, lingerie, and any number of other types of projects. A balanced 3-thread stitch is a perfect lightweight edge finish for light and medium weight fabrics. Straight stitch seams with a conventional machine and finish each seam edge with a 3-thread stitch. Or serge the seam allowances together and press to one side. When sewing seams and knits with a conventional machine, serge the seam edges first, then straight stitch the seam. You can press the seams open. Leave the seams like this, or top stitch each side, an especially good procedure for interlock knits. Or press the seams to one side and top stitch with a single or double needle. Use decorative thread and edge stitch around double-faced polyester fleece, terry cloth, or other fabrics to create fast edge finishes and add embellishment at the same time. Thread both loopers with heavy thread like pearl crown rayon and use regular thread, buttonhole twist, or any appropriate thread in the left needle. Increase your stitch length and loosen the looper tensions. Don't forget to do a test stitching to get your tensions just right. Add an embroidery motif or monogram to your finished project to really make it one of a kind. All of your hems can look more professional when you use your Brother overlock machine to stitch them. For woven fabrics, finish hem edges with a 3 or 4 thread balanced stitch. The weight of your fabric will dictate which one to choose. Then, turn up your hem and stitch with the blind hem stitch on your conventional machine. A few fabrics, like velvet, should be stitched by hand after you finish the edge of the hem. Finish the edge of knits with a 3-thread stitch, then turn up the hem allowance. Top stitch using a single, double, or even a triple needle. You can also use the multi-purpose foot to finish the edge and blind stitch the hem of both knits and wovens in one step with an unbalanced stitch. Replace the all-purpose foot with the multi-purpose foot. Remove the right needle. Set the stitch width to 5 and set the stitch length to between 3 and 4. Decrease the needle tension to between 0 and 2. Increase the upper looper tension to between 5 and 7. And decrease the lower looper tension to between 2 and 4. Place your fabric wrong side up with the hem facing away from you. Fold up the desired hem allowance, then fold the fabric back with about 1/4 inch of the hem edge exposed. Press the fold. Place your fabric under the foot and adjust the guide to where the fold is against the guide and the needle will drop right at the fold. Then serge the fabric. You'll need to do a test stitching as the guide placement depends on the fabric you're stitching. When you're finished, turn the fabric to find a tiny row of ladder stitching. The stitches will be more noticeable on thin knits and almost invisible on heavier knits. Be sure to use a smaller needle on lightweight fabric. Different effects can be created by adjusting the tension on your Brother overlock machine. This is called decorative serging or serger embellishment. Decorative serging can be purely ornamental or can be used to construct and embellish at the same time. Using decorative threads instead of standard sewing thread enhances the ornamental appearance of these stitches. Decorative threads can be used in both the needles and the loopers. Heavier threads should only be used in the loopers and require a lighter tension. Also, a general rule of thumb is that the heavier the thread is, the longer the stitch length should be. Flat locking is a technique in which the stitches are unbalanced to create the look we want. A flat lock stitch can be used to join two pieces of fabric, or it can be stitched on a fold. Either the loop side or the ladder side can be the top side. For project construction, flat lock stitching seams and top stitches in one step, resulting in a finish with little bulk. Thread the machine for a 3-thread stitch. You can use either needle depending on the weight of your fabric and threads. Loosen the needle tension to about 1 and tighten the lower looper tension to between 7 and 8. If you want the loops on top, put the wrong sides of the fabric together. For this type of seam, you serge with the stitches off the edge of the fabric. Since the knife doesn't cut the fabric while serging, your seams must be trimmed first. Use a guide foot if necessary to ensure that the stitches fall off the edge or your seam won't lay flat. Once the seam is serged, pull the seam open. Press the stitches lightly if necessary. A flat lock seam is often seen on items that don't require durable seams, as it isn't the most secure stitch for areas that might receive stress. You can, however, make a flat lock seam stronger, thereby achieving both durability and decoration. Sew a conventional seam first, then fold the fabric on the seam line, wrong sides together if you want the loops out. Set your overlock machine to the widest stitch and flat lock over the seam, again with the stitches off the edge. Pull the seam flat and press if needed. Trim the seam allowances close to the stitching. Serger top stitching can be created in the body of your fabric by flat locking on a fold. Mark your fabric for placement of your decorative stitching. Remove the right needle of your serger and disable the knife. Lower the needle tension to between 1.5 and 2 and the lower looper to between 2 and 3. Raise the upper looper to between 7 and 8. Lower the differential to between 0 and 0.7. Serge along the fold with the stitches off the edge of the fabric. Then pull the stitches open. You can flat lock a decorative hem on casual clothing. Adjust your machine for a flat lock stitch. Fold up the hem allowance and press. Fold up and press again with the raw edge encased. Flat lock, stitching off the fold, being sure you catch the edge of the fabric. Pull the stitching open and press lightly. Your Brother overlock machine can be used to attach ribbon, lace, or other fabric strips to a base fabric. Flat locking can give these strips a wonderful decorative edging at the same time they're being attached. Mark your fabric where you want to stitch your applique. You can use a marking implement or simply press folds where you plan to attach your trims. Fold the fabric and lay your applique piece on top, aligning the edge of the trim with the fold. Serge end to end. Cut the chain and open the fabric. Turn the fabric and fold on the other marked line. Again, be sure that the applique piece lays flat on the fabric and that the edge meets the fold. Serge end to end once more. Cut the chain and pull the fabric flat. The rolled edge is probably the most widely used decorative serger stitch. It can be used for hems, edge finishes, and even seams in delicate items like lingerie. You can quickly give your kitchen or dining room a fresh new look as the seasons change by changing the table linens. Napkins, tablecloths, and placemats really are a snap to make with your machine. To set up your brother's serger for a rolled hem for napkins, remove the stitch finger and remove the left needle. For lightweight woven fabric and standard sewing thread, set the right needle tension to 4, upper looper to 5, and lower looper to 7. Adjust your knife to between 6 and 7, and shorten the stitch length to R. Cut the napkin fabric 18 to 20 inches square. You can use standard sewing thread or decorative thread like woolly nylon. Remember that the tension and stitch length settings will vary with your thread choices, and the knife settings may change with the fabric. Do a test stitch and make any necessary adjustments. Be sure to let the knife shave the edge of the fabric as you stitch for a clean and consistent fabric edge. Here's a tip. Some stiff or loosely woven fabrics may not roll easily, resulting in an edge that isn't smooth. To prevent this, place a strip of tricot bias binding such as seams grate on top of your fabric and catch it in the stitching. Trim away the excess close to the stitches. Some fabrics are too heavy or too loosely woven to roll with a narrow rolled hem. Try using the left needle and change your knife setting to between 5 and 6. Adjust your stitch length to between R and 3. If the fabric doesn't roll, lengthen the stitch. The longer the stitch, the more able it is to roll a heavier fabric. Delicate fabrics like chiffon and satin require a delicate hem, and a scarf edge rolled hem is the perfect choice. Remove the stitch finger and the left needle. Set the needle and upper looper tensions to 4. Increase the lower looper tension to 7.5, lower the differential setting to 0.7, set the stitch length between 2 and 3, and set the knife to 6. Serge the edges of your fabric, trimming as you go. What a quick and easy way to create beautiful scarves and handkerchiefs for yourself or for gifts. Add a feminine touch to ribbing by giving it lettuce edging. Adjust the serger for a rolled hem. Stitch along the fold of the ribbing, stretching the ribbing as you go. Stretch more to get a more ruffled edge. Be careful not to cut the fold with the knives as you stitch. You can ruffle the hem of a knit skirt the same way. Fold the hem allowance up and serge along the fold using rolled hem settings. Stretch the fabric as you stitch. When you're finished, trim the hem allowance close to the stitching. You can use the stitches and techniques we've covered so far in a variety of other applications. If you do a wide range of garment sewing, you're sure to have made spaghetti straps for lingerie, formal and bridal wear, or maybe everyday sundresses. You also probably know that these narrow straps are not always easy to turn. Making spaghetti straps with your Brother overlock machine is simple and quick. Remove the left needle and removable stitch finger. Adjust your tension settings for a balanced 3-thread stitch. Your differential feed setting should be at 0, and both your stitch length and knife setting between 2 and 3. Cut a strip of bias or knit fabric 1 1/4 inch wide and the length required by your pattern. Fold the fabric in half lengthwise, right sides together. Place the folded strip under the presser foot and serge the raw edges. Leave at least 3 inches of serger chain at the end. Thread the serger chain through a tapestry or yarn needle and knot it to hold the chain securely. Feed the chain through the inside of the tube and turn the strap right side out as you go. I'm sure you've noticed those beautiful flowers and chiffon ruffles on ready-to-wear and couture garments. With your Brother overlock machine and some fishing line, you can recreate the look in no time. Let's try a fabric flower. Set your machine for a narrow rolled edge. Thread it with fine decorative thread. One key to beautiful ruffles and flowers is bias cut fabric. Cut a 3-inch bias strip about 56 inches long. Feed the end of 20 or 30-pound fishing line through the small hole in the toe of your standard sewing foot. Then, bring it back toward the rear of the foot. Make sure the fishing line is very close to the fabric bed. Extend the line about 12 inches behind the foot. Turn the hand wheel to secure the line with a few stitches. Place one long edge of the bias strip under the presser foot and begin to serge, feeding the fishing line as you go. Guide the line a little so that the knife doesn't cut it. The rolled edge stitch will encase the fishing line and your fabric edge. When you near the end of your fabric, measure an additional 12 inches of fishing line and cut the line. Unthread the extra line from the hole in the foot. Raise the presser foot and bring the line under the foot and to the left, away from the needle and the knife. Serge off and clip your serger chain. Smooth the fabric over the line, drawing the excess into the rolled edge. Set your machine up for a balanced 4-thread stitch and soft gather the other edge of the strip. Then, roll the strip into a flower and stitch with a hand needle. You can make your own wired ribbon using the same settings with lightweight fabric. For medium weight fabric, use a wide rolled edge stitch or a narrow balance stitch. Use fine gauge craft wire instead of fishing line. You may find it difficult to believe that the delicate look of pin tucks can be created with your overlock machine, but it's true. This effect is easily achieved by stitching a rolled edge on the fold of your fabric. Mark lightweight fabric with a removable marker or by pressing folds. Set your overlock machine for a narrow rolled edge and disable the knife. Stitch along the fold of the fabric. Another heirloom sewing application that you can replicate with your Brother overlock machine is lace insertion. Attach insertion lace to fabric with a narrow flat lock stitch. You can choose to have either the loops or the ladder stitches on the top of the fabric. Set up your machine for a narrow flat lock stitch. Remove the stitch finger and disable the knife. Thread your machine with lightweight decorative thread or standard sewing thread. Fold the project fabric edge back 1/4 inch and press. Lay your insertion lace on the folded edge of the fabric. If the fabric is right side up, the ladder stitches will appear on top. If the fabric is wrong side up, the loops will be on top. Serge from top to bottom. Then, open and flatten the stitched fabric and lace. Repeat the procedure with the other piece of fabric, being sure the same side of the fabric is facing up. Isn't it great to know that your overlock machine can create such delicate effects? Here's another tip. Insertion lace, which has 2 straight edges, is not always easy to find at chain stores. Check fabric stores that have a good selection of heirloom fabrics and trims. It can also be pricey. So, you may want to practice this technique on inexpensive packaged hem lace. Use a similar method to apply decorative laces and tapes to either the edge or the body of your project. Start by removing the left needle. Turn your upper looper tension to 2.5 and your lower looper tension to between 6 and 8. The differential setting should be between 0 and 0.7 and the stitch length between R and 3.5. Move the knife setting to between 3 and 5. Attach the multi-purpose guide foot if you have one. Mark the fabric where you want the lace to be, either with a marker or by pressing a fold. Lay your lace on top of the fabric with the straight edge matching the fold. Stitch end to end, then pull flat. You can attach lace to the edge of your fabric by using the same method you used for lace insertion. In addition to the multi-purpose foot, there are several other feet for special applications that are either included with your serger or available for purchase. Make deeper gathers in lightweight fabric or gather medium weight fabric with the gathering foot. Turn the differential feed setting to 2, the stitch length to 4, and the stitch width to between 4 and 5. Slide the fabric under the foot and serge. Adjust your settings for different fabric and different amounts of gathers.
Okay, I'm going to stop the video here. I just wanted to put in a disclaimer that I do not work for the Brother Sewing Machine Company, or do I get any compensation from them. This is just for educational purposes and to show you the fantastic number of features that a serger has. For those of you that have never tried a serger, the Brother is a good machine. I've had it for many years. The only problem I had was with threading it, so I did invest in a better machine that does the air threading, which is quite a bit more expensive. But if you only use white thread in it or add additional thread on to the ends, there's videos on that. You can knot it on and then get it through your loopers that way without taking the old threads out. So thanks for watching, and I think this is kind of a fun video. Happy to have you around. Please subscribe and like. See you later. Bye.